We are told to read things in context when we study the Bible, but what does this even mean? Part of this means knowing how the current passage relates to what came before it. For example, there are some key connections between the fall of man in Genesis chapter 3 and the murder of Abel in Genesis chapter 4. We see that Cain amplifies the sin of his parents. We see that Cain receives worse consequences than his parents in Genesis chapter 3. And then we see a call back to the ground that Adam came from, but this time, the ground is soaking up the blood of Abel. See, these connections will forever change the way you see Genesis chapter 4. So let's jump into scripture to look at these deeper connections. Okie dokie, Genesis chapter 4 is where we are. We're officially starting here in verse 9, but let me give you a little background context. The summary statement for this chapter is that Cain murders Abel, Cain is exiled, Cain has descendants, and then Eve has Seth to replace Abel. If we're going to think of two words that capture this entire chapter, it's favor and it's bloodshed, okay? You can break down the chapter even more to smaller sections, but let me reiterate, there are some key ideas and words that are going to be reminiscent of the previous chapters in Genesis 1 through 3. So when we jump into Genesis 4, you're going to see these ideas and these key words come up again. I want you to pay attention to them, and I want you to know what to look for. So some similar words reminiscent of the first three chapters. The word help, worker, fruit, ground, desire, contrary, rule and dominion, a field, taking, took, and then the curse. And then there's ideas that are reminiscent of the previous chapters as well, such as when God says, where are you? Or where is Abel, rather? What have you done? God says to Cain, curse. You'll see the curse that God extends to Cain. You see the face of both God and Cain, as opposed to the face of the deep, the face of the earth, the face of man in the first three chapters. Cain is sent away. He goes away into exile. The presence of God, man in the ground, and then the creeping beast of the field waiting to pounce. Those are ideas that are reminiscent of the previous chapters that come before this. And then some brand new ideas we haven't seen, and it's super important. I know you're like, get to the text. I will, I promise. But you need to recognize these new ideas. We have not seen any of these ideas I'm about to list. We have not seen so far in the narrative of Scripture. So it's very important. We haven't seen a keeper of sheep. Sexual relations between man and woman. We have not seen the offering of fruit, the offering of fat portions, human anger, sin crouching to attack. We have not seen murder and bloodshed or blood crying from the ground. We have not seen the ground swallowing up blood. We've not seen an image bearer actually being cursed personally. We've not seen anyone being a fugitive and a wanderer, or someone receiving greater punishment than they can handle. We have not seen anyone being hidden from God's face. We're almost done, and you can write all these things down, watch it slower, and take note of it. We've not seen a man seeking revenge, a sevenfold completion, a mark on a person, someone being sent away from God's presence, someone settling in a foreign land, a city being built, someone taking two wives for himself, and then musical and bronze instruments. Whew. Those are very important. All those ideas, brand new to the narrative. Very important for us to take note of. We're going to continue in verse 9. If you haven't watched the previous video on verse 1 through 8, you can go watch that. You don't have to. It says, then the Lord said to Cain, right after Cain rose up to kill Abel, the Lord comes in and goes, hey, where's Abel? You know, your brother. And Cain said, I do not know. Straight up lied. Am I my brother's keeper? So as we continue to unpack how this chapter relates to what comes before it, let's think of ideas that this is reminiscent of. So the second question that God asks Cain here is, where is Abel, your brother? And you go, that's the first one. No. If you go to verse 5 or 6, verse 6, God says, hey, why are you angry, buddy? So this is technically the second question. But Cain actually lies here. This is very different than how Adam responded to God's question in Genesis chapter 3, when God says, hey, where are you, Adam? And Adam is honest. He's straight up about where he is. And when God says, this is a very similar question, where is Abel? Just like God says, where are you, Adam? Very similar question, but Cain responds differently. He lies. Adam did not lie in Genesis 3, though. He was honest, and Cain here is hiding and deceiving. He knows exactly where Abel is. He killed him. And so this story seems to be a digression from Genesis 3. It's just plummeting even more down. Verse 10, and the Lord said, what have you done? If that question sounds familiar, it's because it's exactly what God asked of Eve in Genesis 3. And so now we have both these questions being combined and asked toward Cain. The voice of your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground. The ground. So a couple of things to note about verse 10. This narrative has God asking two questions to Cain, when God only asked this question to Adam and this question to Eve in Genesis 3. So when we go, why does that matter? First of all, we note it. We go, why is this significant? Well, a second question might be, what is this revealing about what's happening compared to what happened in Genesis 3? How do we compare these two stories? What's actually being revealed in this? Also, God asked one of these two questions, I already said that, to both Adam and Eve, but they're both directed at Cain in this story, as if to almost combine Adam and Eve into one here, but it's Cain. Technically, that's what Cain is, the offspring of both of them, so that makes sense. Also, we've seen the voice is a callback to Genesis 1 and 2. And you go, what are you talking about? God's voice echoes through his work of creation. God speaks creation into existence. God speaks order into chaos. And God speaks structure and order out of disorder. He speaks to man. And then in Genesis chapter 3, we have Eve listening to the voice of the serpent. We also have Adam listening to the voice of his wife. And so both, Adam and Eve disobeying God's voice, listening to another voice. And now this time, the voice is referenced, but this voice is the voice of a murdered, righteous man crying out for justice, which Jesus will reference as the blood of righteous Abel down to Zechariah in the Gospels. And now you are cursed, the Lord declares, Cain, cursed from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. He is appropriately accusing Cain of this crime. So the opening of the mouth here, the ground has opened its mouth. This is very important. And you go figuratively, metaphorically, the ground is opening its mouth. Also, in a kind of literal sense, it is. The ground did indeed soak up and swallow the blood. And you go, well, that's not the blood. The ground actually like drinking in the blood. In some sense, the ground is absorbing the blood. That's what's important. The opening of mouths here is especially present in the last story. Let's think about Genesis chapter 3, where the fall of man involves opening their mouths to eat what is forbidden. Okay? And now the ground is metaphorically and in some sense literally opening its mouth to receive what is not appropriate, what is not fitting in God's ideal, which is innocent bloodshed. Okay, so the ground here, opening the mouth to receive what is not appropriate, is likened, I would say, it's compared to, we can compare it to Adam and Eve doing the same. Also, a question becomes, isn't the ground already cursed because of Adam? Because you read Genesis 3, God goes, the cursed is the ground because of you. And yet here, he says, you are cursed, Cain, from the ground. What does it mean for man to be cursed from the ground? Is this a further, an even further consequence than what Adam received? Is this even worse? Is this going, further into the not ideal? Verse 12. I can't talk, so let's just read the verse, and hopefully more ideas will come to me. When you work the ground, it shall no longer yield to you its strength. You will be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth, God says to Cain. So considering the consequences Cain is receiving, the hand of Cain right here, taking Abel's life, just to call back to verse 11, Cain taking Abel's life is what Adam and Eve did with the forbidden fruit. They reached out their hand and they took what was off limits. Both instances, both Cain here and Adam and Eve in Genesis 3, both are raising their hands in defiance to do what ends in death. Also, the fact that the ground lends Cain its strength here, it shall no longer yield to its strength, whereas apparently before this, the ground was yielding its strength to Cain. It means that even when God cursed the ground, and this is why we track things where we're at narratively, where we're at chronologically in the story, because God has cursed the ground, and so we assume, well, that means the ground's no longer going to help the man at all. But apparently, the ground has been yielding its strength to Cain in some degree. So when God cursed the ground in Genesis 3 with Adam, apparently it didn't mean the ground would not lend its strength to man. It just meant that there would be difficulty now, sweat, pain, turmoil, thorns, thistles. Cain said to the Lord, okay, here's Cain answering back, my punishment is greater than I can bear. Behold, you've driven me today away from the ground, and from your face I shall be hidden. Double whammy. I shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth. Whoever finds me will kill me. Cain is rightly concerned. As he should be, he's freaking out. This concern and fear of being killed, when we think about the narrative so far, we have not seen that present in any of the stories in any of creation up to this point. Adam and Eve didn't have this fear of their lives being taken or being killed. We don't see them voicing that after God declares their consequences. Also, this sequence of events, it seems to follow the same pattern in Genesis 3. So let's think about what has transpired so far with Cain and Abel. Cain is jealous of what his brother has, the favor and the acceptance of God for his sacrifice, and for Abel. Cain becomes jealous and angry. Desire settles in to take Abel's life. He acts on that desire after having a conversation with Abel. He's likened to the serpent in the field, crouching, waiting to pounce on his prey. And then Cain receives consequences, and that's it. That's exactly what we see in Genesis 3. Desire settles in after a conversation Eve has with the serpent. Adam and Eve act on that desire, which is dishonorable to God, in opposition to God, disobedience. God calls them into question. God gives them consequences. You'll see a voice in both narratives. There's a voice here crying out from the ground, and there seems to be a voice of sin crouching at the door trying to get Cain to listen to him versus the same voice we see in Genesis 3. Adam listening to the voice of his wife, Eve listening to the voice of the serpent. So you have all these different components, and almost like in the exact same order, the process of sin takes place, which is what James speaks of. That desire starts within us, it gives birth to sin, and then that gives birth to death. But in this specific situation, even considering how this exact scenario is very similar to Genesis 3, Cain responds differently. Adam and Eve don't even respond to God's consequences that he gives them. But here, Cain does. It's a little different. We almost see this progression in human, maybe even evil is an appropriate word, if not human, I don't know what you'd call it, but Cain seems to go a little further than Adam and Eve even did. Also, verse 14, when it says he'd be a fugitive and a wanderer hidden from God's face, this means, if we think about the narrative so far, this means Cain and Abel were outside of the garden, but they were not yet exiled from the presence of God. Because verse 16 is going to say Cain went away from the presence of the Lord, which means that even after Adam and Eve fell, Cain and Abel and Adam and Eve were not yet exiled from the presence of God. They were not yet hidden from his face and his favor here that Cain is removed from. So there seems to be something going on here that we often fill in the gaps and go, they were cut off from God's presence entirely, no favor at all. That doesn't seem to be what happens. They're cut off from the tree of life, which does involve something, but it's not the total presence and favor of God they're removed from. Also, when Adam and Eve were exiled, they were not hidden from God's face, apparently, because Cain goes, I want to be hidden from your face. This sucks. This is something new. Cain is the first person to experience this. And so I just want to be thinking about how this story is, again, taking the fall narrative even further into depravity and exile and human evil. And then the Lord said to him, not so. If anyone kills Cain, vengeance shall be taken on him sevenfold. And the Lord put a mark on Cain, lest any who found him should attack him. And then Cain went away from the presence of the Lord and settled in the land of Nod, east of Eden. So away from the presence is east of Eden in this land of Nod. This land right here is symbolic of being away from God's presence in the Garden of Eden region. So God placing a mark, well, actually back up to verse 14. Cain is driven away from two specific things. And again, all we're doing is comparing what we're reading now in light of what's come before it. And Adam and Eve were only driven away from the tree of life specifically. God places a mark here on Cain before he exiles him. Now, what does that sound like? What is that reminiscent of? What does that remind you of? In Genesis 3, before God exiles Adam and Eve from the tree of life, he does what? He marks them in a different way by clothing them. He covers them. So that seems to be very similar to what's going on here. And also we have this new land, Nod, which seems to be at odds with and different than Eden. Hey, real quick, don't forget to head to abovereproachministry.com to check out all of our free resources. All of our Bible study courses, devotional studies, Bible study workshops, Bible study worksheets, all of my sermon notes, and more. And while you're there, grab a copy of my book, Fruitful, or snag some church merch. You can also find all these links in the video description below. I'm also very excited to announce Above Reproach Ministry discussion groups, or ARM discussion groups for short. Head to the website if you'd like to see what groups are available near you, or if you'd like to start one in your area, feel free to email me. The first season of video teachings have been compiled into a group study for you and other believers to dive into together. And in the months to come, I hope to have all 9 seasons of these video teachings compiled into group studies for y'all to dive into together. We hope this encourages you to meet and grow with other believers to dive into the scriptures as the body of Christ. Well, that is all I have for you. Let's jump back into the message. When Adam and Eve were exiled, they remained in the general region of the garden, apparently, rather than being sent off to start over, create a new life in a new place. But here, Cain is farther. Cain is removed even more. And so, just thinking about how Cain is the first person to be sent away from the presence of God. And that tells me that in light of what Adam and Eve did, they were still not sent away from God's presence. Depending on how you qualify and define that. They were only exiled from the tree of life and access to that within the garden. Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bore Enoch. When he built a city, he called the name of the city after the name of his son, Enoch. So the next story of human birth, think about the first human that we see born, the first man that's born, is in the beginning of this chapter. Adam and Eve come together, they produce Cain. Cain is conceived as the result of Adam knowing his wife. The second, I guess after Abel, the second woman that is named in the narrative of Scripture, or not even named, that is referred to as giving birth to a man, is this nameless wife of Cain. So, just thinking about how this nameless woman is the second woman, and I'm using the word nameless on purpose, not to diminish her value and significance, but to say the Bible seems to intentionally leave out her name, possibly to make a statement about her bearing a man, in contrast with Eve bearing a man. Possibly. The nameless woman here is the second woman in the entire Bible that we have that has a man. No one else before or in between her and Eve. She's the second. So it's interesting that she's nameless. Also, we saw God make the world. If you go to Genesis 1 and 2, God made the world. He planted a garden. He placed man in that garden, in the world. But now, almost like in contrast to that, we see man building his own thing, which seems to be juxtaposed to Eden and God's ideal. This is man building outside of God's sacred territory. This is man building to survive versus Adam being placed by God in Eden graciously. And so you're going to see Nod and Eden seem to almost be competing entities, cities that are symbolic of those who are with God versus those who are opposed to God. And this will pretty much set the tone for the rest of the narrative. You will have those opposed to God and his people and those who are on God's side. And those who are building outside of God's ideal on their own, in their own strength, in opposition to God's ideal being Eden. They're just surviving. To Enoch was born Irad, and Irad fathered Mahuhael, and Mahuhael fathered Methusael. And Methusael is one of my favorite names, man, fathered Lamech. And Lamech took 2 wives, and you're like, my guy. Not okay. The name of the one was Ada, and the name of the other Zillah. Zillah, like Godzilla. Lamech takes 2 wives. Let's think about this. When God brings a wife to Adam in Genesis 2, which is the ideal, he gives him 1 wife, 1 woman to be with. And again, we just see this contrast between the rebellious ways of humanity versus the right ways of God and his ideal. God gives a wife. Lamech here takes 2. God gives 1, man takes 2. I just want you to see that comparison and that contrast. Ada bore Jabal. He was the father of those who dwell in tents and have livestock. His brother's name was Jubal. And he was the father of all those who play the lyre and pipe. Jubilee. I don't know, that's just what comes to mind. He's jubilous. Zillah, Godzilla also bore Tubal-Cain. and he was the forger of all instruments of bronze and iron. If we can't have fun, why are we here? The sister of Tubal-Cain was Naamah. As my dog barks, I have my own Godzilla. Lamech said to his wives, now this gets interesting, hey, Ada, Zillah, hear my voice, you wives of Lamech. Listen to what I say. I've killed a man for wounding me, a young man for striking me. If Cain's revenge is sevenfold, then Lamech's is 77. Let's think about this. Instead of man listening to the voice of his wife, like in Genesis 3, God says, because you've listened to the voice of your wife, now we see Lamech making his two wives listen to his voice. Lamech here is deciding what is appropriate vengeance. He's deciding it's okay to take life, which is anti-God, which is anti-God's ideal. He's assuming the place of God. God gives life. God decides appropriate vengeance. When he tells Cain, if anyone, takes your life, vengeance will be taken on him sevenfold. But now man, Lamech specifically, is stepping into the place of God to assume the role of creator and judge. Outside of Eden, you have man living on his own terms, man deciding things on his own terms. But here, in Eden at least, in contrast to what's happening outside of Eden, in Eden, you're supposed to have those listening to God and his ideal, letting God decide, letting God judge, letting God create and give instruction. So I just want you to think about that. We've seen the voice before. This time it's flipped. And Adam knew his wife again, and she bore a son and called his name Seth. For she said, God has appointed for me another offspring instead of Abel, for Cain killed him. Cain killed him. So here, I want you to note the language. God, when Eve has Seth, she goes, God has appointed for me another offspring instead of Abel. Let me take you to what Eve says in the beginning of this chapter when she has Cain. Okay? This is a very different attitude and heart posture. Her attitude has changed. And I don't believe I'm reading into the text either. Adam knew Eve, his wife. She conceived and bore Cain. Now, this is wonderful. Some would say, well, up to this point, possibly Adam and Eve have had children, but it's only been girls. And so this is why Cain is listed first as the first man. And she's going, I've gotten a man after all these girls I've been having. And because that's how people make sense of how Cain ends up having a wife. Well, he took from he had an older sister, and that's his wife, and things get odd, and possibly, but I'm not going to plant any ideas definitively on that. But she goes, I've gotten a man with the help of the Lord. So I just want you to see, she does say God helped, but she says, I've gotten a man. Now, someone read that differently, but when I compare it to what she says about Seth, I do see a different attitude. When she talks about Seth, she goes, God has appointed for me another offspring. She didn't say, I've gotten anything, I've produced me, I've gotten a man. God help me. This is, God has appointed for me. These are two, once again, very different attitudes that I see in Eve after this whole thing has transpired. It once again presents God's ideal versus man's way outside of Eden, which seems to be the capstones of this chapter. The chapter starts with Eve having a child, a man. The chapter ends with Eve having another man. But there's a difference in attitude and how she thinks about that, how she talks about that. And if you think I'm reading into the text, let me know in the comments. Share your thoughts. I'd love to talk about this. To Seth also a son was born, and he, that being Seth, called his name Enosh. At that time, people began to call upon the name of the Lord. So when I think about how, up to this point, God has named things in Genesis 1 and 2. Adam has named animals. Adam named his wife, not just Eve in Genesis 3, but woman in Genesis 2. So I just wonder, is it significant that here Eve, she bore a son and called his name Seth? Is it significant that she names Seth here, and then Seth names his son Enosh here? Whereas up to this point, it's just God and Adam naming, and then Eve ends up naming. You go, why does this matter? Because it might speak to just almost the up and down human experience of of people learning how to work with God, learning how to surrender and humble themselves and not assume roles and positions they're not supposed to. Not saying Eve did that, but that seems to be the rest of the narrative. You'll see that throughout Israel's history and anyone God chooses to partner with. So enough of me jibber-jabbering. The next session will be on literary context, but instead of looking backward, we're going to look within the chapter. And we're going to see how the chapter cross-references itself. We talk about cross-referencing. So we're going to do a little cross-referencing within just the chapter, and then we'll have a session on literary context looking forward. Where else in the biblical narrative do we see certain ideas and keywords repeated, or motifs on repeat throughout the story? And then we'll look at allusions to Jesus, and we'll close this chapter out. All right? That's all I got for you guys today. I'll see you guys in the next episode on Genesis chapter 4. Hey, I just want to thank you for all your support and prayers that make this ministry possible and help us to accomplish our mission. Your support makes it possible for us to create all the free resources we have available for anyone around the world. Our mission is to teach people how to read the Bible so they can live and teach the Bible themselves. So be sure to visit abovereproachministry.com for all these free resources and to support this ministry. And if you're a new believer, be sure to check out the new believer section on the homepage of our website and grab a copy of my book, Fruitful, while you're there. God bless you guys, and as always, keep moving towards Jesus.